In this lesson, we're going to learn how to interpolate points on a contour map to draw a slope in section. Now, I've pretty much completed most of the south elevation, and I'm not really going to go into too much detail about what that process was, since it is a literal copy of what I've been doing all along over the last couple of lessons. So you can see, just as a revision of what I did, is that the areas that were closest to us, in other words, the edges or the facade of the bedroom block, are in a darker color so that it appears to be closer to us when we print it out. We could also treat this facade here in a slightly darker color, but because the lines are so close together, I do have a feeling that it will look quite dark already once we print it out. So then the item that we're going to look at in this lesson is the ground line. Now, as I mentioned before, every elevation is just a section in a way, except that that section is being cut outside of the building. In other words, we're cutting a section somewhere through here, and what's actually happening is that we want to show the ground as it's being cut, and especially how it is falling away down to the seaside. And that's exactly what we're going to do in this lesson. We're going to go and turn on the contour layer, and we're going to start looking at how we can now find out exactly where the sea is in this entire section. So what we're going to do is we're going to draw a literal section through a point that we designate. So we can cut through, let's say, this point. Let's make this a nice bright color so that we can see it. And we're now going to interpolate each of these points until we meet the sea level, which is this last dashed line at the bottom. So what I'm going to do, just to make things a little bit easier to see, is I'm going to delete these areas of the plan that we copied, and it's going to free up a little bit more space for us. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell myself that this line, which is the 1 meter line, so that is the natural ground, this one over here, is going to basically be lining up here. It is a good idea to draw in a different color so that you can see exactly what you're doing, otherwise it is going to get quite confusing. And at this point you want to start merging the artificial ground level and the natural level that the contours are giving you. So all of this will make a lot more sense in about a moment or so, once I start to bring all of these points together. So right now we have the point here. This is the first interpolation point. I'm just going to circle it for clarity's sake, not that you have to do this. And I'm going to now start drawing the other points. If you really like, what we could do is we could draw, or at least we could copy these contours, and we could do exactly what we did with the plan. So I'm going to now copy all of this out. I know that this horizontal line is in that position, and I'm just going to make a completely separate copy over here. Then I'm going to use the trim command, and I'm going to trim down all of the contours so that I'm only left with these main ones. I'm just going to recopy some of these contours that I believe have been left out. So I think there are a couple of contours in this area that have not been copied, since they are slightly broken lines. So I'm just making sure that I grab all of that, and I'm going to use an arbitrary point, and I'm just going to trim that down. So once you have a much cleaner area to work in, we now know that this point is equivalent to this contour, so every single line is now going to equate 1 meter. So you can go ahead for yourself and count how many contours you have in total. So this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. So basically 18 meters of height difference. So we can go ahead and make an offset of 1 meter. I'm just going to sufficiently stretch this across, and now I'm just going to start offsetting. I should be counting to 18, but I'm just going to continue going until I pretty much get a feeling that I have enough. Just going to color this a darker color, and now what you're doing is you start to draw ray lines, so R-A-Y, vertically down, And let's go and copy those. So this is basically a manual interpolation process where we take a section line and we basically plot that section line for ourselves. And then what we're going to do is we're going to draw either a spline, so SPL, or a polyline. I'm going to go the polyline route first, and I'm going to just start drawing from point to point. So basically every single intersection is going to get a point. So you can see that this is very, very steep, and then over here it becomes a lot less steep at the bottom. And there we have it. At this point, we end up with the sea level. So then you can go and delete all of these points. You don't need these lines anymore either. And that is basically your natural terrain. So what you want to do now is you want to take that line that you've just created and you want to move it back onto your plan where you can integrate it with the rest of your drawing. So you can see now that this pink line over here, the magenta line, is a natural level, and this is the artificial level that we have filled in just so that we can get a pool area. But also know that there are different depths to this line. This line is being cut because we are cutting quite far in front of the building, but once we start cutting here, in other words just in front of the pool, we're going to get quite a different result. So theoretically what I should be doing, and what I will do, I'm going to pause the video now and going to redo this process so that basically we get a foreground and a background. The foreground is going to be cut like so, which is going to be this magenta line. That's going to be the thick line that's being cut. And then in gray, I would like to show where the slope is basically coming down so that we get almost a three-dimensional effect happening. So let me just turn these contours off and I will then just explain what the result will be. So what we're trying to get out of all of this is that at this point we will have a line that is being cut through the ground, and this is the foreground being red, so in other words thicker lines. Then the background will be the building, the pool, all of this overhanging, but we don't want to make the people watching the presentation believe that this entire distance is being cantilevered off this. We need to understand that there is a difference in depth in this elevation. So I'm going to pause the video right now. I'm going to do the second contour line and then we'll see what that result is. And here is the result. The line has been drawn and we end up with this quite gradual line that ends up at the same sea level area that has now been marked as sea level. So what this does in effect is it shows us that in the area that we have just in front of the house, we have quite a steep drop, and that we have this much more gradual drop that is supporting the swimming pool in this area. And it is only this part of the balcony that is really overhanging this cliff edge and giving us a very dynamic facade as it reaches out and looks over the sea. So what we can do now is we can have a look just in the final few seconds of this lesson. We can have a look now at some of the landscaping elements that can be added. Now if we turn on the landscape, I've prepared 3 elevational images or blocks of landscape. So we have a palm tree and we have a larger tree and we also have a bush, and this is exactly the same one that we used in plan. So all that really needs to be done now is just need to reposition some of these elements according to the location in plan. So pretty much the same process, set up a construction line and move the object into place. Then what you can do is you can either trim the object by opening it up like so. You can trim it neatly so that it has a horizontal line. Save those changes and just move it into place. Then you can decide whether you need to scale it up. You can also move it slightly left and right. What's quite important as well is the composition of how you reveal or hide certain parts of the architecture. So here I may want to actually move it slightly out the way. I might even want to move it quite far along. Since this is quite a big planter, so that position can actually change I may even want to look at rotating it. The main thing is that I don't obscure my architecture, but rather add value. So the other thing, perhaps we just increase the scale by, let's say, 1.2, and we can see how that looks. And you basically just use the landscaping to emphasize and enhance the building instead of just hiding it or obliterating it with too much information. So here I'm just going to put 1 or 2 trees to indicate that there is a treed area behind the house, but I'm not going to necessarily line it up too much that I don't obscure the text, and I also don't want to push the text all the way out. So you've got to think of all these things so that you basically end up doing a good bit of justice to the drawings themselves. So the bushes, they can be added into the foreground just to soften the front of the elevation, and you can basically just add them in a few critical areas. Nothing too much, less is always more, and there you have it for this facade. So that pretty much brings us to the end of the facade and the sections. There are definitely more details that can be done, but I would like to leave it as this so that we can move on to much more critical things in our presentation, which is actually setting up our paper space, setting up the layouts, and actually getting this CAD plan over to Photoshop so that we can start doing the final touches.